Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca L. Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides. Today we have a conversation with poet, storyteller, and essayist Roberto Carlos Garcia that we're excited to share with you. This interview took place on October 7, 2023 via Zoom.
Yes, welcome back, everyone. Actually, in a sense, this episode is kind of like a follow-up in a way to the season 2 episode that we did, Afro-Latinidad and Literature, Afro-Latinx Poetry, in which, along with We Are Owed by Ariana Brown and Love is Hard Work by Miguel Algarin, we discussed Garcia's poetry collection, Black Maybe, an Afro-Lyric. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode yet, we recommend going and checking it out after you're finished with this episode. We'll include a direct link in the show notes for easy access and searching.
So before we start the interview, we will include a bit of background on Garcia, including his education, publications, awards, and other projects.
And after the interview, we'll wrap up the episode with our thoughts on the conversation, along with some personal recommendations of specific poems from Garcia's anthology, What Can I Tell You?
So as a little background, poet, storyteller, and essayist Roberto Carlos Garcia is a self-described sancocho of provisions from the Harlem Renaissance, the Spanish poets of 1929, the Black Arts Movement, the Nuyorican School, and the Modernist.
You definitely got that vibe from him just through the conversation, right?
Yeah, we can see like all those intertexts coming together in the interview, definitely. He writes extensively about the Afro-Latinx and Afro-diasporic experience. His work has been published widely in places like Poetry Magazine, NACLA, Poets and Writers, The Root, The Breakbeat Poets, Volume 4, Latinx, The Root, Gawker, Bettering American Poetry, Volume 3, and many more.
He's also the author of 5 books, including 4 poetry collections, Melancholia, published in 2016, Black Maybe, an Afro-Lyric from 2018, Elegies, published in 2020, and the recently published What Can I Tell You? The Selected Poems of Roberto Carlos Garcia, which was published in 2022. The 5th book, which is an essay collection entitled Traveling Freely, is set to be published in 2024. Garcia is the founder of Get Fresh Books Publishing, a literary nonprofit and cooperative press. He's also a native New Yorker and holds an MFA in poetry and poetry and translation from Drew University, and has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, which is an award for small press publications in poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction.
So we'll keep this short and let Roberto tell us a bit more about himself and his work. All right. Bienvenido, Roberto. Welcome. We're really happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us at the Latinx Vision podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
Yeah, so we are, we're really excited to get into the conversation. So we'll just dive in with our questions. And the first question is, nothing big. How did you find your way to writing poetry? Like, what are your poetic origins?
That's a great question. It's such a roundabout story. I used to write comic books when I was a kid with a very good friend of mine. He lived across the street from me. And so we would read comic books and watch all kinds of cartoons and things like that. And so I would just, make up my own adventures. And a lot of times we would play in his backyard, and we were just very creative. We had these imaginations. And then one day we decided to, okay, I'll write them, you draw them, I'll draw some comic books. And from there, as I got older, the stories just changed, they became a little more mature as the cartoons got more serious, the comic books got more serious. But then also I was writing song lyrics because, my grandmother, may she rest in peace, she had all these awesome bolero records that she would listen to.
Nice.
Yeah, on the weekends. And so, I was also writing songs. And, I went from writing, like love songs to writing hip hop lyrics, because then hip hop became very popular. And so all throughout, I'm going to say junior high and high school, I was part of a band that we were trying to put together, because this was the birth of the grunge rock scene, Nirvana.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that's us too.
Right.
We're from that era.
So, but I had a foot in both worlds, so to speak, because I was also writing, hip hop lyrics and hip house music. There was a form of house music that had rapping in it. I think of Fast Freddy, right, was one very popular. Two Without Hats was another group. There was all these, Black and Latinx hip house artists that were creating. Like, there's this song I'm sure you probably recognize. Even una brisa y fue, even una brisa y fue, y me la paga.
Yeah.
Right? We were so deep into that music because my friends were DJs. And so, I guess over time, one thing led to another. And as my lyrics for hip hop music became more politically conscious, it naturally led me towards writing poems about it.
Nice.
Because there were certain rappers who were so poetic in their delivery and in the ways that they communicated. And so it just became one more thing to write, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why I love writing poetry, but I can also write essays and fiction and more experimental stuff, because I was just always dabbling, always trying to find a way. We didn't have all the distractions that young people have today. We had to entertain ourselves. We had to, use our heads and entertain ourselves. And so, I just kept writing poems over the years. And one day I decided to take it very seriously and go study it in college, on the recommendation of one of my creative writing professors. And once I started to take it seriously, the rest is history. Opportunities kept coming up and opportunities kept coming up. And I got encouragement, from some wonderful poets along the way that told me, you have some talent, keep writing, believe in yourself. And
that's awesome.
Yeah, I was very, very, it's hard to believe it when, you know what I mean? When you're, when you're first starting out, it's so hard to accept and say probably, yeah, I'm a writer. Yeah, I'm a poet. But eventually I did own it, and here I am.
You. Although I am curious to see, like, I love if you did have a comic or a graphic novel come out now that you're more evolved in your writing style.
There are manuscripts.
I'm a big fan, so
thank you.
That's my, if I could take your poetry and put it to like a genre or a medium rather that I really love, I think that would be really cool. So, we read your most recent poetry collections, kind of a volume that takes from all of your previous collections. So we were curious about what inspired you to sort of create that collection, and if there was like any sort of particular thematic through line that you envisioned as you chose the poems for that collection.
So funny story, and I'm also a translator. So I went in my graduate program, I studied translation, and I've translated a bunch of Pablo Neruda poems because I love Neruda's work. And it's really funny that every time I'm about to publish the translations that I did of Las Alturas de Machu Picchu, right? I took Machu Picchu.
Oh, wow.
Every time I'm about to publish that translation, the owners of the estate or the rights to his poetry, they tell me, well, a different group owns the rights, and unfortunately, no one else can publish it at this time. And so before my first book was published, I was going, a publisher had agreed to publish the translations. And then we got word from his agency that we couldn't get permission. And so the publisher said, well, do you have anything else? And luckily I did. I had my first poetry collection, Melancolia, and they published it. So fast forward, my publisher, Edward Vidaurre at Flower Song, was about to publish the translations of Heights of Machu Picchu. And, we tried to get permission, and they said, sorry, somebody has the rights, so you can't publish it. And we had a conversation, and he asked me, what do you have as far as poetry? And I was like, well, I'm working on essays, I'm working on fiction, so I'm probably gonna be stepping away from poetry for a little while. And he said, well, why don't you put out a selected so that people can find all of your work in one place in the meantime? And I was very resistant to the idea at first, because I feel like I should have made 5 or 6 books or something before I do something like that, but because I publish with small presses, I like the freedom that it gives me. And, I like when people are engaged with what it is I'm doing in my work, and so I said, he convinced me. I said, all right, let's do it. Let's select the best or what we have from these 3 books. And this way we can leave folks with something, right? And we can and then I can run off and focus on novels and short story collections and essay and
comic books.
And yes, it's funny you say that about the comic books and the graphic novels, because I do have a few manuscripts, graphic novel manuscripts that I'm working on. Yeah, there's a lot to do. So yeah, I'm very interested in getting into that. But anyway, that's how I came to the selected poems, as a way also to provide, I guess a blueprint or a snapshot for people of my trajectory as a poet also. And because when I was publishing, a lot of the poems that I was writing about anti-Blackness in Latinx culture, about anti-Blackness in Dominican culture in particular, people didn't want to touch that. They just, for whatever reason, even publications that feature Latinx writers and poets, etc., they weren't interested in that. And so I was very fortunate that the author Kiese Lehman, he was an editor at the time at the now defunct Gawker.
Okay.
And I submitted my poem, my essay. It's titled now Black Maybe, but it was originally titled Hiding Black Behind the Ears, on Dominican racism in Haiti. And he loved it, and they published it. And then, that essay was like semi-viral, right? And it really opened the door. It really opened the door. And then there was interest in the manuscript. And then I was able to publish the book, and it took off. But even then, there was a lot of pushback, because, there was a lot of, why are you painting us in the negative light? There's no racism in Latin America. We're all, and I'm like, give me a break, But it was interesting to join, a group of Afro-Latina scholars who have been writing about this in academia for a while and getting books published, and then to try to bring that message through poetry, hopefully, somewhat into the mainstream. And I think we've seen some progress, over the few years. To be able to go to the University of Notre Dame, and there's an entire conference on Afro-Latinx poetry and literature. I thought that was fantastic. Rarely would we, see something like that. But Francisco Aragon did a phenomenal job setting that up. And then Kiani Antigua at Dartmouth College also picked up the baton. And so we're starting to see a little more of it. But a lot of institutions are still very problematic. And so
I love Kiani. I took classes with her in grad school
way
back when. Yeah.
She's amazing. Her energy and her creativity and her productivity are just inspiring. Right? Inspiring.
You already started answering our next question. As it is
Oh.
precisely about Afro-Latinidad, and how one thing that you make clear throughout all your poetry collections is that Afro-Latinx identity is multifaceted. So can you expand on that? Tell us about how those complexities of Afro-Latinidad show up in this anthology, and how do you see like the three collections talking to each other regarding that topic?
It's interesting because I think that my experience, being born in New York City, living in New York City, and then living in New Jersey, it gives me a unique perspective because, one of the things that, I've heard is I'm writing about this Afro-Latin experience, but it's very much through a Black lens, right? It's a Black lens. Why? Because Blackness is centered. It's not there's this idea, that you're a Latino and you're Black, right? So as if Latinidad exempts you from something connected to Blackness, right? As if culturally there's some kind of exemption or exception to being un afrodescendiente because you're part of this Hispanic culture or Hispanophone, right? And so I don't really agree with that. I think that's nonsense. I think that you can pull, un Afro-Colombiano, un Afro-Boricua, un Afro-Dominicano, un Afro-Cubano, and they will have vastly different experiences, but there'll be a lot of things that are similar or exactly the same because they're Afrodescendientes.
Right.
And so wherever we are, we're Black first. Whether you say Black, you say Afrodescendiente, Negro, whatever you want to say. And for me, it's very important that I be uncompromising and unflinching in that, in the work. And that there can be no avoidance of facing racism. Because as we well know, in Latinx culture, racism is so customary. It's so customary that even when it is blatantly happening in front of you, to someone or to you, there's people who just will not, they won't accept that it's true. So something like that really requires this adamant commitment to Black self-love and, the acceptance. So I think one of the things I love about that Césaire quote that I have in Black Maybe is the acceptance of it, right? The understanding of it. And it's something to be proud of, because it's a beautiful survivor's history on this side of the planet, right? It's one of the greatest survival stories, I think, in the history of humanity, because from this situation of the transatlantic slave trade and this horrific experience, Afrodescendientes, whether it's African American, Afro-Latinx, Caribbean, or even Afro-Europeans, have shaped this world on this side of the planet culturally, socially, politically, in ways that they try to hide from us. And only through a radical self-love and acceptance can we go out there and realize this fact that, everything is like, we're the root, we're the stem, we're the heart of so much. So that's why it's so important.
So you mentioned a quote from Black Maybe, but there was also a quote that you had in What Can I Tell You that really stood out to me. It was a Gwendolyn Brooks quote, "I am interested in telling my particular truth as I have seen it." And so I was just curious, like, how do you ensure that you're able to do this with your own poetry? And are there any poems in particular where it was maybe easier or more difficult to accomplish this?
So I like that quote because no two Afrodescendiente experiences are alike. And until the more, whether it be poems, the more novels, short stories, essays, movies, plays, whatever it might be, the more art we create that tells the story of those unique experiences, I think the better it'll be for us to understand each other. The easier it'll be, for a Black man from Mississippi to understand a Black man or woman from Trinidad and Tobago and from Cuba. because hopefully within our stories, I'm a big Pan-Africanist, right? I'm a big believer in this idea of negritude, right? That Cicero was proposing. I know that, a lot of people try to poo-poo it, and I often say I'm trapped between Cicero and Glissant, right? Because Cicero is so committed to this idea of this unifying force of negritude, and Glissant is so committed to this idea of power in our difference, right?
I think that makes sense.
It does. And I think that neither one has to be mutually exclusive, right? I think that there's this in the combination of both, but the only way I can be truthful in my art is to speak from my experience. And it's very difficult because even though the poems are not, let's say, I know they sound autobiographical, but I think that there's just enough of me in there that people recognize these experiences in their own lives. And so they can say, well, wow, this is the experience that this poet is putting forth based in a Dominican cultural or a Dominican American cultural context. But wow, it's so similar to mine as an Afro-Cuban or an Afro-Boricuan, Afro-Colombian, right? Which is what I hear when I go out and do readings and people come up to me.
Building off of that, I think like you have also defined yourself as a lyric poet. And in this regard, and I want to present a quote that you wrote, many of my poems, you said, have a first-person point of view, what you were just talking about, led by an immediate and a steady I. You see, I'm a storyteller. I have something to tell you, to share with you, my interior life, my experience, the depth of my emotion, my music. Yet you clarified this. I has the ability to be social, unstable, aggrieved, one among many. Yeah, that one among many is really powerful. Can you unpack for us that idea of this unstable lyrical voice?
I got to bring it back to hip hop because, as we know in hip hop music, in particular, the braggadocio aspect of it, the MC creates a kind of persona that is capable of being this superhuman figure, right? That will defeat another MC, or that can endure, stories of street life, if that's what they're telling, or whom can be this politically active or engaged person, right? And so lyric and first person narrative, I think, is one of our oldest and most primal ways, I think, of communicating and expressing ourselves. And I think that when we're reading a novel, as we go on and that first person narrator continues saying I, if we are engaged with the text and they have us hooked, we become that I. We experience those things. We feel those. And so that's why the I, I love that first person perspective for that case, but also because you have to interrogate your own experience first. Right. And this is something that I learned from reading James Baldwin and just kind of being obsessed with all things Baldwin, because he was in his work, he is so interrogative, right? He goes so deep in his investigation, not just of himself, but people in general, and those closest to him even, which at first, early in my poetic career, was a challenge because, we have this philosophy, lo que pasa en casa no se cuenta, you know what I mean? We have this, right? But in order to tell a truth about who we are and what we experience, we do have to interrogate those. We do have to ask questions about ourselves, but then also the people around us who love us and we love. And that first person medium is a great way to demonstrate that, I don't know if I want to call it courage, but what goes into that investigation, if I'm making sense. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is the reader completing the poem as well?
In a sense,
there's an element of the reader
response.
Finding themselves, herself, himself, within the poem, and adding their own memories, references to what you're presenting, right?
And I think you do it in such a way that, like, for me, as someone who is not Latina myself, like, even reading some of these poems, really like connecting with certain elements of them. While I don't have that same firsthand experience, you know, there were definitely some poems that really jumped out to me and, like, you know, had me emotional as I'm reading through them. So I think that way of bringing in the eye also makes it a little more global, while at the same time not erasing the specificity of the experience.
Yeah, I was taught early on that the specific becomes universal. It's very paradoxical because, as we know, when something is generalized, it's hard to sink your teeth into it. It's hard to connect to it. But the more specific an experience is, the more details that are there, then it's more realistic. It feels more authentic. And people can connect to what is detailed and what is authentic. It mirrors, it reflects. I think you used the word earlier, Rojo, multifaceted. And I think that as long as it has those multiple facets of specificity and detail, you can connect to some part of it. I've had other writers like from Egypt. I've had writers from places like Thailand and Bali. There's a lot of colorism, in particular, because there's so many different gradations, right? Of
Anti-blackness is global, yeah.
It's global. It is so global, and they recognize the experiences and the intrapersonal racism that happens, be it on a familial level or be it friendship or professional. They recognize that, and I've had people come up to me and say, even I'm not Dominican, but I understand that experience, what you're talking about. And so I think that, I'm grateful to that. And I'm glad that one of my friends and former professors, Pat Rosal, he uses this expression, I'm glad the poems still have legs. I'm glad that they still can walk around minds and hearts. Yeah.
Talking about walking around, I would like you to talk about the importance of the vernacular in your work. Yeah, you recently wrote an essay on Willie Perdomo's poetics, but also you reflect on your own poetics. And I would like you to kind of tell us a little bit on your conception of the vernacular, and vernacular currency in specific, and how you connected to this lineage of other Afro-Latinx poets like Perdomo or John Murillo, Araceli Garmé, among others that you constantly mention and put yourself in conversation in your collections.
So I'll tell you guys a funny story, and I think that it's funny the way we carry internalized racism, or the way that we believe these narratives, right, that we're taught. My undergraduate experience was full of Eurocentric professors, very, very Eurocentric literary study. Brit Lit 1, 2, American Lit 1 and 2. Not a lot of survey courses or samplings on African American literature, Latinx literature, Asian literature. None of that. It was very Eurocentric. And so I left undergrad really lacking. I had a hole in my study of literature, right? And so my poems began to change. They started to sound really bad, right? Just as they started taking on the shape and form of a lot of these older European poets. So that by the time I got to my creative writing program, it was just bad. I was very lucky that I had Gerald Stern. I had this, I don't know if you guys have heard of Gerald Stern, this magnificent, famous poet. He passed away recently at the age of 90 something. So he lived a wonderful life. And we're sitting in this workshop, and we're going through this poem, and he looks at me and he says, I have some problems with this poem, and I hope that that's okay. I said, please, I'm here to learn, just whatever, I don't care, and he proceeds to he's shredding the poem. And I remember after that moment, I remember the first time I heard, Willie Perdomo's Where a Nickel Costs a Dime. And I was going through corporate America. I worked in corporate America for a while. I had to, I had to code switch a lot. I really did.
Mm.
Here's this kid from the streets who's got this heavy street accent, a lot of slang. And I had to like code switch a lot in order to survive in that environment. And so I'd kind of left some part of myself behind. It was hidden away. And so through realizing, hey, I have nothing to be ashamed of. This is who I am. This is how I talk. The world is trying to steal my language every day. So I need to embrace with that. And through reconnecting with the work of Willie Perdomo, the New York Poets School, my old hip hop songs, my lyrics and stuff like that. I said, this is who I am. This is how I sound. And even though I have this love of imagery, and I have this love of the sounds that the Spanish language can produce, right? And the way that the Spanish language, at least Dominican, Caribbean Spanish, let me put it that way, Caribbean Spanish, can be so imagistic and descriptive, and can signify almost in the same style that African American vernacular does, right? So once you start to analyze it, it's so similar. It was very freeing, but I was shackled because of, I was trying to survive and all that stuff, and I'm trying to make it in corporate America, and I had kind of built up this weird wall around who I was, so that I wouldn't be punished for it in corporate America, right? And I had to like rediscover myself and rediscover my vernacular, my language. And that then became something very sacred to me. Not just to say, hey, I will never let go of this again. I will always hang on to who I am and how I sound and what I say. As a matter of fact, in the essay collection, there's an essay which I traveled to Spain with my family, and I kind of, part of the essay is me meditating on, okay, how am I going to sound to these Spanish people when I start talking, right? But then also the internal politics that we have of who speaks the best Spanish, right? And who speaks Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also like a thing, right? In Latinx culture. So, to make a long story short, the importance of that vernacular, again, to get back to this point of authenticity and to this point of specificity. There is a power in our language, because I think that throughout our experience as colonized people, we are always reshaping the master's tools and making them our own, so that we don't lose what we don't know we've lost, but we sense, right? So I'm sure that those early enslaved Africans all across here, as time goes on and they're further and further away from their African culture, tradition, and languages, somehow this new language will have an aspect of that. Somehow this new culture practice will have an aspect of that, right?
Yeah.
And so the way that on a street corner we can engage and speak in a conversation that even another American may not understand, I think these are traditions that have been passed down, that keep, linguistic traditions that have been passed down and continue to change and take shape. And I think we need to continue to embrace that. Maybe you guys will remember the name of this scholar who said that what we need in the Caribbean is a whole new language, so that we don't speak English, French, or Spanish. I always forget that scholar's name, but
I don't know. I would trust Rojo to know this.
Yeah, I always forget. But I think that vernacular is one way in which we try to accomplish this, right? And just to illustrate, what I mean, recently I was at a book party. I'm also a publisher, and so we were throwing a book party for the poet Mercy Tellis Bukhari. And there was a gentleman who had gotten on a boat from Senegal, sailed to Central America, ended up in Nicaragua, and from Nicaragua with his family joined a group of people walking to the United States.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a journey.
That is a journey.
Yeah.
It, on multiple levels, it's so interesting to me, because when we think about the transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage, that was a journey that was taken by force. And here there are people, fleeing certain conditions, on the continent of Africa, now taking this perilous journey by choice, which is just wild to me. But he makes it to Texas. He's put on a bus to New York. And there he is, asking for money, or he asked me, do I have a job for him? In any event, I said, I'll buy you some food. We go into a restaurant. He's from Senegal. He speaks French. We're communicating through the Google Translator, basically. And there's a woman in the restaurant, and she's Nigerian. And, her English is better than his. And we're trying to communicate with each other. And it's so difficult. And I say, man, look at the African diaspora. We have Nigeria, we have Senegal, we have the Caribbean, we have this African diaspora, all of us looking at each other's faces, we're all Black, and we can't talk to each other.
The brokenness of diaspora, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was just, crazy. But in any event, I would be thrilled to see a language we could all learn and speak that's not tied to the colonial powers languages. But I think that the vernacular that we invent somehow is us trying to get to that, right? But somehow it's not necessarily forgetting ourselves and giving in completely to the language of capitalism, which is, very propagandistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have talked about Glissant, you have talked about Césaire, you have talked about many theorists today, James Baldwin, right? And I was thinking that in all of your connections, you also present yourself as a theorist. Yeah, you present your poetics to the reader in one way or another. An example of this could be your exploration of the term melancholia in the book of the same title, or your examination of the Dominican and Latinx anti-Blackness in Black Maybe that you referenced, that you were talking about before, or your definition of the mixtape that is very connected to hip hop and to the vernacular, right? So what is the function of theory in your work? And what type of engagement do you search with the reader by explicitly stating your poetics?
I thank you for such a compliment, because I really admire theorists. There's some theorists, who I'm still translating in my own mind, right? I think it's such important work to think about these things, because it's a luxury that we're not always given. Right? I think in this capitalistic world, I think marginalized people are always working, or focusing on survival, and not necessarily given that space and privilege to theorize, right? Everything has to be so concrete. I enjoy theory because of the avenues it opens up and the ways it allows me to think of things differently. But I hesitate to call myself a theorist, because there's people who are doing it so much better than I am. There's so many wonderful scholars. I feel blessed that Dr. Maricel Moreno and Dr. Silvio Torres Ayan would even grace the pages of my book, right? But then also you have Loria Garcia Peña, Mayra, Figueroa Vasquez. You just have Tania Kateri Hernandez. You just have all of these wonderful scholars, and I think that I'm not capable of doing that work in that way, but I do believe that the theory they're writing is speaking to the poetics that I'm putting together. And I think that my poetics, because I think of the relationability of the experiences, is also infused into their theory. So I think there's this wonderful kind of symbiosis maybe occurring between a lot of poets and scholars of the Afro-Latinx tradition and the African-American tradition, obviously, and the Afro-Caribbean tradition. And so it's food.
Yeah, it's really interesting because some people create artificial borders around those two areas. And one thing that you do is say, no, actually, we can talk theoretically, but we can also do our poetics and we can talk our vernacular.
Yes,
right? So I think that gesture is important of not believing in those borders.
The walls that academia would put up between that have traditionally been there.
Yeah.
Right? Where academia would look askance at poets or look askance at novelists, say theory is where it is, right? But we understand that those borders are or those barriers are artificial.
And they work together, right? They complement one another.
I think that that's becoming more explicit now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In this wave of Latinx, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Caribbean theory that we're seeing, that symbiosis is becoming more explicit. I hesitate to call myself a theorist for that reason, because there's so much work that goes into it that I'm not necessarily doing. I'm speaking through certain experiences and investigations, as opposed to this empirical evidence and research, and like years and years of slow burn, right? Like 10 years of research on a book, etc. So that, out of respect, I think, for what theorists and those theorists and scholars are doing, I always hesitate to call myself a theorist, but the work definitely feeds what I'm doing. Not only as a poet, okay, but as a Black man in this world, I'm always looking for confirmation on things. Hey, I'm not crazy. Because this world will make you think you're crazy sometimes for seeing the things you see and experiencing the things you experience. There's this, it's like a practice of negation that, the white supremacist culture engages in, of negating the seriousness of your experiences, of negating the experiences of the discrimination, the deprivation. And so what a lot of the theory really allows me to do is say, yes, okay, yep, I'm right. I know this
confirmation.
This is confirmation, and I think it's great. I think it's great. So yeah.
And just like including the voices of all these individuals in your work is, again, like I was thinking, this idea of lifting up these other voices and sharing them, amplifying their voices as well, which I imagine is something that is a part of your work. You mentioned in passing that you have a publishing company. It's Get Fresh Books Publishing, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of this project, your ethics behind it, and the work ethos within this cooperative press?
It's, it's about inclusivity, obviously, and creating opportunities, but it's also about trying to create a model. You want to talk about theory. It's about trying to create a model that's not necessarily like the capitalistic model of publishing that exists now. And so it's this work in progress of always trying to figure out how to survive. I always preface by saying this, that I'm not trying to cast aspersions on publishing companies who charge submission fees and who operate on that model, because that income allows them to pay people and to operate and do a lot of different things. If anything, I'm casting aspersions on, a country, a political engine, an economic philosophy that does not believe that the arts have value, and does not make it easy to publish books and things like that, and then to get that art in the hands of other people. And so, that is our model, where we have an open submission period, people can submit, and we want to publish Latinx, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Caribbean poets. If you look at our roster, I'll just give you guys evidence of this. We were at the Brooklyn Book Festival. Someone came up to our table. They saw our books and they said, "Can you point to the books written by males on this table?" And I said, it was like, oh my,
very specific.
Somebody, right?
You wonder, are they going to challenge this, or
yeah?
Where is this going?
But he's trying to instigate, because our table is, it's about 85%, women identifying authors, or authors from the LGBTQ plus community, Black, etc. And so that was his beef, And I said, well, here are 2 books written by men, right? I said, but you can go anywhere and find a book by a man. They make up 77% of the people published, And I said, and heterosexual white men, I said, like you, and and I said, no knock, but I think that number could come down. It could go down to 50%, and you guys would still be way ahead, but it would be a lot more inclusive, So that's one of the reasons why I started it. That's one of the reasons, in conversations with a bunch of fellow poets from graduate school, and discussions and conversations, I said, let me try this and see how long it will go. And so, how does that show up in my own writing? This idea of not just inclusivity, but collaboration, right? I'm a big believer, and I was always taught that literature is a conversation, right? And that walking into a room and now you join a conversation with people. And so I'm sure there's a lot of individual discoveries and things in my work, but there's also a lot that has come from engaging with the work of others that has allowed me to discover, how to communicate my own experiences through the art. And having those voices present in my work, allows me to, I don't know if it's to say thank you, but to acknowledge that conversation.
I like that.
So since our podcast is called Latinx Visions, we have a question about visions, precisely. And the last line of your poem, I want to refer to one of your poems, Variation on Lines of Dialogue from Bill Murray's Groundhog Day, says, "My yesterdays are my today. Every day I can't trust tomorrow." Can you tell us about this conception of time, and maybe going against this poetic affirmation, how do you envision Black futures?
I'm very much a pessimist. Let me just start by saying that. And I think if you read my work, you can see that. I'm not necessarily interested in happy endings or neat resolutions. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. As a student of human nature also, I have these two books that I'm reading, and a friend of mine, I'm looking at the title. One is Pathogenesis, How 8 Plagues Shaped the Course of History, right? And the other one is The End of Eden, and and how the climate chaos is taking shape and what it means. I'm very much a realist, and I think that when I think about the future of colonized people, and that includes, indigenous, African, you name it. Okay. And I see that the colonizer in the state will only continue to double down on everything. Whatever does happen when the bow breaks, so to speak, which I'm sure it will, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty. And I guess I'm trying to do everything I can so that if it happens while I'm here, to be prepared for that. So that, like my ancestors, I can survive it. I don't know what it may hold. I mean, in my deepest heart and soul, I really would love to see a bloodless revolution where, capitalism goes away, equality comes forth, and all of this wonderful things happen. But my focus is just on being as prepared as possible for whatever may come, for getting through today, and being as ready as possible for whatever might come, because, we just never know. We just never know. And one example is, never in a million years did I think that, the blabbering buffoon that is Donald Trump would get anywhere near the presidency. And oh my God.
Right.
So that's why, people say I'm very pessimistic, but I tend to consider, I think maybe I'm a realist. It's not that I don't have hope. I do. But again, I'm just preparing for what really happens.
It's also an awareness. I feel like you also presenting an awareness of history, the history of, as you were saying, of the concept of the human, but also of of the history of the African diaspora. Many people argue that the apocalypse started centuries ago. For Black people, it started many centuries ago.
Yes, and it's an ongoing kind of apocalypse, right? And so it's it's so important to be ready for that reason, and to be a student of history, because if you dig, right, if you don't just accept the narrative that's presented to you and you dig and you see what the reality of history is, there should be no way that you can go through life with these blinders, right? And I don't begrudge optimistic people. I think we need all kinds, right?
I think there's also a difference between being like overly optimistic and having, or just optimistic in general and having blinders, right? Because one, you're like, yes, I acknowledge what has happened, but I'm hoping that we can make some of these changes. But, I can also see that side where you go, well, we haven't done it yet, and we've been around for quite a while.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of where I'm at. And
unrelated, kind of related, book recommendation for you. It's called The Storm Before the Storm. I don't know if you've read that.
I have not. The Storm Before the Storm, but I'm writing it down right now.
Yeah, it's about the fall of the Roman Empire, and there's a lot of parallels.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
A lot of parallels.
We could do a whole podcast just about that, right?
Yeah, right. Anyway, we wanted to thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming on here and talking with us. We got to talk about Black Maybe in an earlier episode that we did, but to hear your voice firsthand and sharing your perspective on things was really appreciated. But before we let you go, is there anything that you want to plug for us? And also, where can our listeners find you and your work?
Keep an eye out for the essay collection. I think it's going to be very engaging. It should come out in the fall of 2024. And if you like poetry and you want, you want to continue to hear marginalized voices, check out Get Fresh Books. We're doing some wonderful work. We've been around for 7 years. We're a nonprofit, and it really is a labor of love that, we do it for the love of poetry. It's me and a very small team, of interns and wonderful people. So, check us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
A la orden. You guys are doing wonderful work, and I tune in to the podcast, and you gave me a new short story writer to listen to. What is her name? So I've caught COVID twice, and so the long COVID that I deal with sometimes is foggy brain, and then my memory, remembering things, and so But in any event, I love the show, and I'm just so glad it's available. Because I remember a time when we didn't have that. So
thank you. I appreciate it.
Maybe you're talking about Amina Gautier.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. No, she's wonderful. She's wonderful.
Listening to her talk about the genesis of her stories and in her experience with publishing, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful for people to hear. People who are trying to put it together, people who are looking at the big bright lights of big publishers and things like that, to recognize that there are other alternatives. And that's, I was like, yes, that's why I started Get Fresh Books, because there are alternatives. There are people who are looking for your specific kind of work and aren't trying to change you or change that work. And
we're making connections here too. You all can reach out to each other.
I think I definitely will.
We definitely appreciate your work, and we appreciate the work you're doing with Get Fresh Books. And it's been really great talking to you.
Thank you.
Wow, what a fantastic opportunity to be able to speak with one of the poets that we had covered in a previous episode, right? I mean, I always appreciate the passion that authors and creators bring to these conversations. So having that previous episode and this to complement one another is really cool.
Again, please listen to them together. Yeah, it's a good combo.
Exactly. I was fascinated to hear Roberto talk about his journey to poetry. Just like many artists and creators, he put it into practice from an early age. And I think that this is key, right? He had encouragement that kept him going, and he worked at it and he got there. And he's still working at his craft. He was open to learning. He wanted to become a better writer. And, I think the way he discusses that in the conversation really shines a light on that work. And honestly, I definitely hope that he gets to do some sort of comic or graphic novel someday, because that would be really cool to see. I also got a kick out of his like pessimist realist approach to life that he was saying, because well, it can come across as dark. I think it's important to recognize that, you know, everything is not sunshine and rainbows, and that we really need to acknowledge all the facets of life in this world and recognize both.
Yeah, at the same time, he defended his commitment to Black love, to Pan-African culture, marginalized voices, and Afro-descendants everywhere. And that radical self-love already implies an affirmative vision that is palpable in his poems and the publishing project he leads. I particularly love Roberto's ideas of literature and poetry as a conversation and a reflection or theorization about the losses, maneuvers, and reshapings of diaspora. His impression of the West stealing his language away was very powerful as well, because it positions the vernacular as sacred.
Yeah, I really like that as well, because it's giving validity to voices that have been silenced for so long. So, you know, we read his most recent collection, right, that takes some selected poems from each of his first 3 books. Were there any for you, Rojo, that really stood out to you, that resonated with you in some way?
Yeah, as a father of 2 children, and the child myself of divorced parents, the poem Elegy for Bill Withers touched me a lot. This is part of the collection, but it's also, in particular, part from Elegies. Yeah, in it, the poetic voice talks about the everlasting connection and joy he experiences with his daughter. It is a bittersweet but very authentic poem. It describes how the end of the parents' relationship is burning as it burns, quote unquote, waiting on their daughter and dragging her joy down. The poem proceeds to tell how he takes her daughter out one day, and they move from the tense handoff in the court language to the father's car, where soul star Bill Withers' classic song "Lovely Day" is playing. And I'm gonna read one stanza because I feel like it's really powerful, and I just wanna present that to our listeners.
Please do.
Yeah. So we have Bill Withers' song playing in the background, and the poetic voice says, "And just like that, we're singing and laughing, and there's no impossible days, and joy rises from the soles of her impossible sneakers, and escapes as the truest voice I ever heard, and we are sky and free, we are love."
Oh,
I
beautiful.
feel that there's a lot of tenderness in how this song hits and heals their soul, and they regain their mutual joy. The poetic voice trusts that this father-daughter bond is as expansive as the sky and a true expression of freedom and love. It is lovely indeed.
Okay, so the other day we were talking about this in preparation for the interview, and I was saying that there was one poem in this anthology that actually made me cry. Like, I was sitting there with tears streaming down my face, and this is exactly the poem that I was thinking of. So I think it's funny that same one jumped out to both of us. You know,
we're on the same page, literally.
Literally, yeah. You know, yeah. I don't have my own children, but like you, I'm also a child of divorced parents, and I really felt the bit when he talked about the tensions weighing on their daughter, right? Like, I'm getting choked up now thinking about it. Like, it was seriously the poem that most resonated with me and was the most relatable to me. You know, in the interview, I mentioned, you know, as someone who is not Latina, I still found poems in there where I could see myself or part of that universal in the specific. And this was absolutely one of them. But beyond that, I think another poem that really stood out was the one called "The Day a Poet I Looked Up To Clowned Me." And this one was originally published in Black Maybe. We may have discussed it in the other episode. I don't remember, but like, it's still, it sticks with me so much. I've actually taught this one in my class before when we were talking about this feeling of being in between or not belonging, right? Like, too Black to be Latino, too Latino to be Black, and that concept. And it's just the callous way in which this other poet dismisses him, right? So like, when I read it, it's not completely clear, but it doesn't matter if the words, "oh, you're not black, were actually said out loud, right? It's the feeling of being rejected and isolated that really stands out there. And you can feel that aloneness when you read that poem. That's how I read it anyway. I just felt I was alone in that room with him, just watching everyone else around him.
Yeah, that's a great poem that in a specific illustrates how youth imperialism and exceptionalism also influence notions of blackness. And the poem makes clear how the global Black diaspora is sometimes erased to keep dominant U.S. perspective. So Roberto Carlos Garcia pushes us to think beyond those reductive frames.
And I hope we keep seeing more of him doing that in the future with his essays that are coming out and any other future projects he has. So thanks for joining us for this episode. Remember, you too can share your thoughts with us. You can always reach out to us on social media or by email.
So follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. We'd love to include your thoughts in a future episode.
Subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Share us with your friends and family, subscribe, and leave a review on both Apple and Spotify if you can.
We out. Seguimos a la escucha.
Dale. Until next time.